Welcome to HUQUQ Podcast. Today, we're tackling a daunting topic: how climate change, poverty, and human rights violations form a tightly interwoven web. Can you explain what systems thinking brings to the table when addressing these overlapping crises?
Absolutely. Systems thinking pushes us to see beyond individual issues and recognize the feedback loops connecting them. Rather than treating climate change, poverty, or human rights as separate, we examine how actions in one domain ripple through others like a spider web. Tugging one strand affects the whole structure.
That makes sense. For instance, cutting carbon emissions isn't just an environmental fix, it impacts jobs, health, and even migration patterns. Are there real-world examples where a lack of systems thinking has backfired?
Certainly. Take the push for biofuels, intended to reduce emissions, but in some cases, it led to deforestation and spiking food prices, hurting vulnerable communities. This illustrates why siloed solutions often worsen the very problems they seek to solve.
Reframing our approach is crucial. As we transition to specifics, let's explore how environmental degradation exemplifies these tangled interactions.
Sure. Let's unpack the ecology of collapse and see how pollution, climate, and inequality collide in everyday life.
Our environment faces unprecedented pressures. Air, water, and soil pollution threaten not only ecosystems, but human health. Can you break down the scale of this crisis for us?
Of course. Air pollution alone causes over 7 million premature deaths each year, particularly in cities across Asia and Africa. These same regions often lack robust healthcare or regulatory oversight, compounding the harm. It's a stark example of how environmental and social vulnerabilities reinforce one another.
That's staggering. And pollution isn't just urban, right? Rural areas face threats from pesticides, heavy metals, and water contamination. How does this impact food security and the rural poor?
Precisely. Soil and water contamination undermine crop yields and make food unsafe. The rural poor, already struggling, face even greater risks as access to clean water shrinks. Over 780 million people lack it globally. It's a vicious cycle. Environmental breakdown deepens poverty, which in turn accelerates further degradation.
Given such feedback loops, tackling pollution isn't just about cleaner air or water, it's about disrupting cycles of disadvantage. How do these dynamics connect to broader social outcomes, like migration or conflict?
When natural systems fail, livelihoods vanish, driving displacement and resource conflicts. These aren't isolated events, but symptoms of systemic breakdown: climate, economy, and rights all collapsing together.
Let's shift focus to poverty, which both results from and worsens environmental stress. How does poverty shape a community's exposure to environmental harm?
Poverty dictates where people live, often in flood zones or near hazardous sites. Limited resources force reliance on biomass fuels or informal waste burning, which degrade both local environments and health. This isn't about choice, but survival amid systemic exclusion.
And it's not just that the poor are victims. They're also, out of necessity, drawn into practices that perpetuate the problem. Could you give an example of this reciprocal relationship?
Sure. Smallholder farmers, lacking access to sustainable technology, may overuse fertilizers or clear forests for agriculture. This leads to soil depletion and increased emissions. But without structural support, alternatives remain out of reach, locking communities into harmful feedback loops. According to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNESCO, and some non-governmental organizations, approximately 43% of the Earth's land surface is currently considered degraded, with 25% being highly degraded agricultural land. It is estimated that 20% of irrigated land is seriously degraded, hampering crop production. If these negative trends are not urgently addressed, 95% of the Earth's soil could be degraded by 2050.
So traditional policies that ignore these connections can actually entrench inequality. Are there models or interventions that successfully break this cycle?
Integrated programs like combining clean energy access with microcredit and education show promise. For instance, solar microgrids in East Africa have reduced both emissions and household poverty, illustrating how multi-pronged strategies can disrupt negative cycles.
As we draw connections across these crises, it's clear that piecemeal solutions fall short. How does systems thinking guide us toward more effective, just interventions?
As a holistic approach that relies on knowledge integration, systems thinking emphasizes cross-sector action. Transitioning to renewables, for example, slashes emissions, creates jobs, and improves health. But it also warns us, subsidies or reforms can backfire if they ignore local context or exclude marginalized voices, fueling new injustices.
That highlights the need for inclusive governance immunized by strong civil society institutions. We may not be there, but what are some real-world examples of people-centered, systems-based approaches making a difference?
Agroecological farming in Latin America improves yields, restores soil, and empowers indigenous communities. In Bangladesh, community-led flood adaptation blends local knowledge with policy support, showing resilience grows when solutions are adaptive and participatory.
The path forward isn't a single silver bullet, but a transformation of interconnected systems, cultural, economic, political, ecological. Any final thoughts on how systems thinking reshapes our vision for the future?
It shifts us from crisis management to root cause transformation. By embracing complexity, centering principles instead of group interests, and highlighting the interdependence and interconnectedness of systems, we may be able to move from systemic collapse to reverse the current trend and set humanity on a different course that considers not only the well-being of some social group here and now, but human beings all over the world and over generations. From a systems thinking point of view, human rights cannot survive if our actions are driven solely by the narrow, short-term interests of privileged individuals, entitled social groups, or powerful nation-states.